Once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
And it is not a question of a little occultism or a touch of mysticism, Mr. Denton. It is vampires. It's a host of damned souls of telepaths.
I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night.
Here, the old gods aren't dead.
And what of the true god?
He's dead. He can't complain.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
You're listening to Paranormal UK Radio.
Hi everybody, this is Irene Allen, the host of the Paranormal UK Radio Show, the flagship show of the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and whatever your name is.
See, you haven't forgotten my name in quite a while now. So you know what? You got to say it. Say it. Say it.
Oh, Mark Johnson.
Yay. Round of applause.
Oh, my God, Mark. I don't know what's the matter with me lately when I start opening this show.
You know what? I understand the opening is a tongue twister, but, you know, then it gets you so flustered, then you forget my name.
Yeah.
Which, you know, I know I do have a very forgettable, you know, name, but still.
Well, I've got several names.
Yes, I got a few names for you as well.
Yeah, I bet you have.
Uh-huh.
But I've got several names I go under, you know, so it's difficult for me at any one time to remember who I am at that particular time.
You know, it's all that covert stuff.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how's the book coming along? That good, huh? you know your faithful audience is waiting for it.
Yeah, I know. I said it's releasing in June, and I will get it out by June. At least by the end of June.
Well, you remember
I will do it because I'm going to really knuckle down and do whatever I'm going to do in the next couple of weeks so this book goes out.
Remember, it has to go to me first.
Yeah, well, you'll be pretty quick with it, won't you?
I hope so.
Just don't put any American spellings in it.
No,
please.
I keep it all British spellings, so it's all prim and proper.
Make sure you do. You just make sure you do. Otherwise, it'd be back and forth, and it'd never get out.
Just wait till your fans read the sex scenes in this one.
No, I kept them very, very low key, didn't I? I was pretty good. There was no absolute implicit descriptions of what were going on. No.
No, it was not like a Harlequin romance this time, or like an issue of Penthouse.
Yeah. Well, the first book I'll tell you what. The first spy book I ever wrote. I put so much, and I had to really change it all to make it very, very low and supple and one thing or another. But when I first wrote it, there was some of those scenes, you never got to see them. They were really naughty. I tell you, any man reading that in bed would have been playing tense. They were honestly, Mark, it was so naughty. So, and I reread it, and it even shocked myself. And I blushed. I literally blushed at it. I thought, I can't put this out. So,
yeah,
that's why it's all been kind of quietened down, and it's just very good sex scenes.
Well,
sex, spies, secrets, people. That's what this book's all about.
Psychic spies, don't forget that. And that, remember, here we go.
It's not only psychic. It's not just psychic spies, is it? You know, it's the old MI.
But the name of the book is A Psychic Spy Recruited, available on Amazon and in both softcover and Kindle.
Yeah.
See, we had to get that plug in.
And the new book?
The new book, A Psychic Spy Operation Paris, coming soon to Amazon or Kindle near you.
Yeah, and the next book?
Next one we're working on.
Next one, she's going into Russia.
Well, that
if I do another psychic spy book, she's going into Russia.
Well, we won't have to worry about seeing that for another 5 years. It's about as long as it took to get the last one out.
Oh, you're awful. You really are awful.
Yeah, I'm blaming your friend tonight. Yeah. I think he's having an effect on me.
Yeah, you behave. You just behave. The next book that's coming out is about the ring.
We've got the Ring book, and I've got one that I'm working on too. So,
oh, come on, let's have the secret. What's your book?
Well, we've talked about this. It's like,
but
it's about my experiences.
It's your experiences. So it's one of these quick coffee table books, is it?
Yeah, it's more like a pamphlet.
Oh God!
Something you'd receive in your mailbox.
Let's definitely go through the letterbox.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. No, it'll be a good book. It will be a good book, Mark. You should do it. You should complete it.
Yeah, I just got to get off my... when you get... And those of you who do write, and we've had so many authors on our show, I'm sure you understand, unless you're Nick Redfern, which, he'll write books on demand. I think he publishes 10 a year. No, I think that's an overstatement. But
I think Nick's a speed writer.
That boy can crank out books like 2 to 3 a year come out.
Yeah.
He is always writing.
Well, any good writer can. It's just people like me that can't. Because I start to write, then I think to myself, I'll have a cup of tea. And then I get waylaid because something's on the television in the other room or something. And I sit down and watch that. And then when I go back to the computer to finish the book or do something with the book, I think, bugger it, I can't be bothered. So I switch off.
I started mine a year ago, wrote like a chapter or two, then put it away until just about a month or so ago. Picked it up, started writing on it again. I get bursts of inspiration, and then I put it away for a bit, and then I come back to it. But I really got to start focusing on it because, I'd like to get it out before I'm, start collecting my Social Security.
Now, come on. People, Mark will be getting a book out in 1967. Don't miss it.
1967. Am I time traveling for this one?
Well, if you write you've written a chapter in a year, it's going to be 1967 at least before this book comes out.
It's 2021 now, right?
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Are you like jumping through time and dimensions again? You got to stop that.
I'm trying to behave myself. I really am trying to behave myself because we've got a smashing guest on today.
Yes, we do. So why don't we go ahead and get right into that? So let me introduce our guest. Tonight we are speaking with a demonologist. His name is Nathaniel Gillis, and he has done research on the devil, demons, and unclean spirits with a twist that he believes there could be a connection to the implants found in people who have been abducted by aliens, as well as some other very interesting aspects. So we want to welcome Nathaniel to the program. How are you tonight, Nathaniel?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
He's given up and gone home.
Yeah, he's heard enough of this and said, "Oh, no, that's it. I'm out of here."
Yeah. So that's messed up one of my questions to you about extraterrestrials. So you obviously have done that side of it. Mm-hmm. That was one of the questions I was going to ask you, actually.
Well, that's one of the things that he talked about before we came on the show, that we get into the meat of it in the first part of the show, and then we will be jumping into a lot of that. So,
right.
So let's.
That's how it usually goes.
So let's go ahead and just jump right on into it. So, we'll get the standard radio show questions out of the way so that we can sit here and have a great conversation. So, what made you become a demonologist?
Well, I grew up in a haunted house, and I was 8 years old when my family moved into a house in Dayton, Ohio. And it was really interesting because the very first full-bodied apparition I ever saw occurred in the opening house, like when we went to go tour it. And so once we moved into the house, I was confronted by a malevolent presence that affected me from the ages of 8 to 15. And so from 15 years old on, I really wanted to understand what I encountered and why it was that, it affected me so deeply. So that was really my push into this phenomenon. And since then, I've been doing my best. I mean, I research full-time. I lecture full-time. And so that's what really inspired me to get into this field.
So,
go ahead.
Sorry, Mark. I was just going to wonder, how did it affect you?
Well, it was very traumatizing in a way, because there would be days where I couldn't sleep at all. And so especially if it was during the school year, I would turn all my lights on. I would constantly try to connect to people. I would try to talk to my parents or wake them up in the middle of the night because, for whatever reason,
you were a child, weren't you?
Yes, I was. And the entity that I was encountering, it would only come to me at nighttime. And when it would enter my room, it would fill every void in that room. It would make me feel like I was the smallest particle in the universe. And to this day, sometimes I don't sleep at night. And truthfully, I think it's because that left such an impact on me as a child. But,
So do you still live in that house? Did you inherit it or anything? Or have you moved away? Did it follow you or anything like that?
It didn't follow me in terms of the manifestations. And to answer your question, yes, we did eventually move out. But honestly, I think that
it marked you.
Yeah, it marked me. And, it really helped me grow a certain immunity to these entities. Yeah. Like when I go into houses, I mean, I've had actual murder cases where I've had to go in and do cleansings. And for whatever reason, they don't affect me as much as that original haunting affected me as a child. So that's what really left an impression on me. And to be honest with you guys, I mean, the only coping mechanism I had available at that age was to treat this entire phenomenon as a language that needs to be interpreted instead of allowing it to plague me or to victimize me. I really hungered to know more about it and to answer the questions that haunted me.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Mark, before I interrupted you?
Well, two questions, actually. With these experiences and in your research as you move forward, do you consider yourself sensitive?
Oh, deeply. Deeply. I mean, I know that's a big word and there's a lot of definitions to it, but I'm sensitive to entities. I'm sensitive to people who need deliverance, need assistance. And I think that's one of the reasons why the entity targeted me at that young age. I think that the spirit that I was wrestling with was suicide. And I believed that it was either somebody that committed suicide in that house or it was the entity that influenced the person to commit suicide. And so that's why I wrote my first book of moment called Man, is because I didn't understand why I was being targeted. And for the longest time, I blamed myself for it. If it wasn't somebody gaslighting me into making me feel like I was crazy, it was me feeling vulnerable, left alone and abandoned, and feeling like I was the only one that could fight for myself when everybody was, in bed. So it's a heavy topic, but it really added a lot to my life, and it helped clarify my own calling.
Yeah. I worked on a case once where I was called in by a young mother that was having problems in a house that they just bought. And to cut a long story short, 2 generations in the house before, a man had committed suicide. And then an old lady that they bought the house off, when she was younger, her daughter went into a terrible, terrible depression, very suicidal. And in those days, back in the 1960s, that's not when I worked it, but this is when it happened. Back in the 1960s, it was practically scorned on, you had to take your daughter then to a doctor, a psychiatrist or something. In this country, people thought, it was really bad. And eventually that girl was pushed by this previous entity into committing suicide. She hung herself from the attic. You know, she and I actually saw it when I was tuning in. She was up in the attic and she rigged up to the joists a rope, and then she dropped through the attic hatch. She committed suicide that way.
Ouch.
And this thing was still hanging around the house. And of course now a young mother moves in with a young husband and a baby, and it starts its work again. So
That's exactly right.
yeah.
It's a unique victimology that we deal with regarding these entities. I know, like, later in the show, we're going to get into the incubi, the succubi, we're going to get into the sexual pathology. But to be honest with you guys, there's a lot of empaths out there that are medicating the gifts they're called to manifest. And what usually happens is they do suffer from obviously it's either suicidal ideation if it isn't committing the act itself. And so, that's one of the reasons I wrote my first book. But that's also what really inspired me to dive headfirst into this field, to really not just help other people, obviously, but I really wanted to understand myself in the process and get a better grasp on what people are going through.
Yeah.
Well, my second question, and again, this will be kind of going into help setting the stage for as we go forward in our conversation, is did you grow up particularly religious, or are you religious now, or have your beliefs altered or changed since you've been doing this?
Very good question. So during the ages that I lived in that house, my parents were attending a local church. So while I was going through that haunting, I was still trying to fit my personal experiences into the blueprint that I was given in that church. And so growing up in traditional Christianity, the very first thing I realized was that there was no room for shadow figures in their worldview. It just didn't exist. And I was going to my Sunday school teachers or going to, my youth pastor, my leaders, and just trying, not even just looking for answers, looking for some kind of advocacy, looking for an ear to hear exactly what I was going through. And I realized very quickly that they didn't have room for it. And when they didn't have room for that, they no longer had room for me. And so once we left that particular assembly, like I said, I was forced to grow out of the microcosm there. Like I had to leave that tradition and I had to abandon it because I knew for a fact what I experienced was real. And it really didn't matter to me if it fit what they believed in. And so that's when I kind of had to lay the traditional, what's called systematic demonology aside. And I had to go to the ancient Near East, read manuscripts, and dive into the literature to understand that their dogma is not based on data. And I had to kind of go through a deliverance period myself. And thankfully, once I poured myself into the literature, I got a better understanding of it. And it really makes a lot more sense now.
That's good.
And see,
it's a growing process.
Yeah, it's the same with me. I mean, I grew up in my parents dragged me to Presbyterian church when I grew up in Los Angeles. And, I tried when I was younger, I tried to believe and get into it. And as I got in my late teens, early 20s, I just realized my belief systems were taking me elsewhere. And because you're right, there's a lot of it that it didn't have a lot of answers. And then the more I studied and the more I learned how much of, and again, this is not to offend anybody who's, I'm not anybody's belief systems. This is just my own personal opinion in my own, doing my own searching is, most of what we think of as organized religion is created by man. And
exactly.
especially Christianity with what, the Romans did and councils of Constantinople and Nicaea and putting together the quote unquote canonical Bible while getting rid of all the other texts that they didn't quite like. And
exactly right.
And one of the things that really fascinates me is the fact that the idea of the devil as we think of in modern Christianity really doesn't appear much. in the Bible. In fact, if anything, I would subscribe the character of Satan, which was not the serpent in the Garden of Eden. They try to say it is now, but it was never even implied that was Satan or Lucifer or whoever it was. But more, I would liken it more of a adversarial trickster spirit, let's say like Loki in Thor mythology, or in Native American cultures, the coyote, that trickster element. So let's say when Jesus is fasting 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, and then he has a vision. Actually, sounds like a vision quest to me, like Native American lore. Probably 4 days, and they made it 40 just because they love 40s in the Bible. And then Satan comes up to tempt him. And there was nothing really evil in what he was doing. It was like playing that adversarial part. And so personally, I think that character of Satan gets a bad rap.
You're right. And it's sad, I mean, my dad it's funny. My dad's a pastor right now, and he's been pastoring for 15 years. So I grew up with a lot of Bible scholars, people who are very much literate in ancient Near East texts. And you're exactly right. But there are a lot of people that do not know the linguistics. They don't know the literature. And so, they're very dogmatic in their understanding of even just demonology. And what ends up happening, unfortunately, is we have the ufology field who looks at these particular people, usually evangelical researchers, and they base other demonologists' work off of what these dogmatists believe. Does that make sense?
It does.
They look at me and say, you know what, you're just like them. And I'm thinking, well, just give me a chance. I have to, it's really, it's a pain because I have to literally like separate myself from them to a point where a lot of people will kind of lump me in with the dogmatists before they even give me a shot.
Right. And it's funny that you mentioned like the UFO people, because I know of a couple of different UFO researchers that, and I'll say he's a friend of mine. I don't agree with what his theories, but David Stennett, he believes that the UFOs, the aliens, are actually demons. Yep. So, and I guess when we get into that subject, we can talk about that a little bit more later on. There is some similarities there. There is some inner, how would I say, overlapping kind of phenomenon there, but I don't, but they consider from a religious standpoint as demonic. And, but then it's really easy for the fundamentalist Christians, or even of any religions, the major religions, to point at something they don't understand and say that's of the devil, that's of Satan. Right. I mean, hey, let's look at all the witch trials we've had in the UK and the US, and you're in league with Satan, and so
you're right. And not to interrupt you, I want to make a real quick point here to add to what you're saying. It's really sad because there have been many cases where we have researchers that fall into a certain category that are evangelical, where they almost go to the point of having to manipulate the data to fit their narrative. Like there's one researcher I know, I won't mention by name, obviously, but he's built a 70-year career on one word that he mistranslated. Just one word. And he's got a massive following. And I'm thinking in my mind that we need better researchers, not in the sense that we need people that have better character. I think we have tremendous people, right? I just think that we need people that are willing to set their dogmas aside if the data sample doesn't back it up, because the data sample can't lie. You
got to go where the evidence leads you.
Right.
I mean, there's, are you familiar with John Zaffis?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I know John. Hell of a nice guy. And, of course, being the nephew of Ed Warren, and Ed and Lorraine Warren, who investigated so many cases, and now they're making these Conjuring movies very loosely about them. I mean, it's a loose, let's just say it's a noose about 5 miles wide. That's how loose they are. But, again, they come at it from a very strict Catholic upbringing, and the ideas of demons and the devil and possession and all of that. And so, again, they're coming at it from in my my perspective, a very narrow point of view. And
yes,
I think that there is sometimes a lot more evidence that's available that some of these people could ignore because of their own biases.
You're exactly right, to their own detriment. Because a lot of times what we've had, like you know what I think is actually happening, guys. I'm just going to be very real with you guys. It appears that a lot of these researchers, they do not have a good grasp on the demonological literature. I've talked to researchers that have actually been liaisons and counselors for like movies and stuff. So these are the people that go to Hollywood and sit down and say, you know what, this is what I believe the case was about, and this is how I believe these entities respond. And they really give advice and guidance to people like James Wan on how to create a real haunting. And I've talked to these people, and these people are still under the understanding that a Dybbuk comes from a wine box, completely ignorant of the 16th century phenomenon. And what I'm thinking in my mind is, God help us if we have 70-year-old researchers who don't know. They're still stuck on the pop culture. God help them if they go into a real situation when you have an entity that does not hold to the faith of Catholicism.
Are you loosely referring to Zach Bagans' Dybbuk box in his museum?
Just, yeah. Anything that'll make a couple dollars and feed into the narcissistic pathology and sacred cows of pop culture. You know, whatever makes money, it sells tickets. And the truth is, if we have that kind of research, my field of demonology is not going to last long because the data sample is already outgrowing it. We're going to be obsolete if we don't grow along with them.
And you know, here's something I'm just going to interject right now to say I'm very impressed with you and your point of view and how you're coming across, because in most times we've talked with demonologists, they do come from it's the same thing with paranormal researchers and investigators. Most of the people we've encountered, you know, they started watching the ghost shows when they first started back in the, you know, mid 2000s with Ghost Hunters and then all the other spin-off shows. And then they keep parroting the same information over and over and over again. Right. And the information they're parroting just comes from a ghost show where when some investigator says this and they take it as gospel. And a lot of those views are very Victorian in nature, you know, coming from the old Victorian spiritualism mixed up with a little Christianity, and you know, it pops out to this is what they believe is happening in the world of the paranormal, where in our research, it's a hell of a lot stranger than what most people realize.
Exactly.
I mean,
very true.
There's a conference I used to go to all the time. In fact, they're restarting it this year now that COVID's over in Gettysburg, called Phenomenology, and they bring in all of these researchers and everybody in the paranormal is there. All the TV show celebrities, they're doing lectures. They have big vendor room, and I used to have a vendor table, and we'd promote the radio show and my investigations and whatnot. And now that they're coming back this year, I saw it and I go, I really don't have much of a desire to go, because
you've outgrown that, Mark.
Yeah, because this sounds very arrogant of me, and I don't mean it to be arrogant, but I feel like they're still in elementary school, where at least I'm at least starting college. I still have a long ways to go to get my bachelor's and master's degree, but you know, it's like they're so.
Where am I then?
You're a professor.
I'm just off to my wine box to have a look for a dive.
Yeah, you're the headmistress.
And I definitely understand your feelings, because, you know, I've also been frustrated because lately I've seen nothing but puppets regurgitating the points of peasantry.
I hate that.
And it really is peasantry, because there's a lot of researchers that are complicit with the phenomenon. They hide in the shadows along with it. They partner with the pain. And then people like me and other researchers like yourself, we have to go into houses where we deal with wives who are being plagued by a sexual entity, an incubus. And they're shaking. Like I had one lady shaking the dinner table as I felt the entity walk in, and I'm talking to her, and as I'm talking to her, she's telling me everything that she's done lately to combat this entity she got off of a TV show. And so what we have here is that they're getting their education from actors.
Yeah. Yep. And here's something for our listeners. And again, this is, I really want to stress this. We are not bashing anybody. Right. What we're trying to do is educate and get people to think outside of the box, think outside of the norm. Because you know what? I used to be there. When I first started in this field, I was the exact same way. I started my paranormal group. We did the exact same thing. And even though we started before the paranormal shows, it was all basically the same thing. You go into a house, you investigate, you find some evidence, give it to the client, and move on. And you know what? I realized after a time, we're not helping anybody. And we're still not getting any closer to what is going on with this field. And it wasn't until I got a hold of, a couple of really fascinating cases that really started to change my point of view on the paranormal in general. Plus hanging out with Irene, that's really done a lot for me as well.
It's good. And I think everybody
I've educated him. Sorry, darling, what did you say?
I said, I think everybody needs an Irene, though, We need that kind of leadership.
An old wise one.
Yes, a sage.
The old crone.
Go on.
I don't even know
what were you going to say, Mark? Go on, what were you going to say?
I just said
I'll zap you through the screen, you know that.
I just said, it's like in a lot of, the older cultures, you have the wise old crone. Doesn't mean you look like an old hag. I'm just saying, you have it's the three forms of femininity. You have the maiden, the mother, and the crone. So look at it that way.
And I can be all three if I want.
Yeah, and I've seen it too. It's interesting to say the least.
Yeah, I'm very good at transforming, I tell you.
That's funny. You guys are a mess.
I was going to say, enough of our ranting. Let's talk more about your experiences.
Okay, who's going to ask the question next then?
You go. I've been ranting enough here.
Yes, you have. No, so what's your idea of a demon? What would you describe a demon like?
Okay, demons are not horns and hooves. A demon is disincarnate consciousness.
That's right.
Period. If we go back to, if we strip the data from the dogma and look at it for what it is, even if we go back into biblical antiquity, the ancient Near East, it originated, the idea of the demon, before it was the demon, it was basically a little spirit.
This is what I hate about this. Words like demon, they're man-made.
Right.
You can't give this a name. You recognize it by feel.
Yes, exactly right. And we were limited to descriptions, not definitions. And that's what really destroyed us. It really destroyed us. So,
like a dislocated soul of a person, or the consciousness.
Right. Exactly right. Consciousness. And in our ancient texts, we have what's called the little spirit in Mesopotamia, and the little spirit was just a person who died, and they believed that when they died, that their breath left their body, and that breath became the ghost, or what in the New Testament in Greek mythology, the demon.
Yeah.
But most importantly, guys, if we're going to get into my research in terms of demonology, we need to understand that what they did in antiquity is they demonized consciousness. They demonized it if they encountered it and it was malevolent.
I'd have to say of all cultures, like the Navajos, in Native American, they kind of do the same thing. Their belief is when someone dies, if they do what they can to make sure that spirit doesn't hang around, because they feel if someone's spirit hangs around, it becomes almost like a demon. It starts causing trouble, can make sickness, can be mischievous. So they won't even say the name of a person who's died for fear of attracting that spirit.
Exactly right. And so what we have throughout history and different cultures is we have two different, I guess, forms of consciousness that would be earthbound. Number one, we would have an entity, I should say. We would have an entity that is lingering because it's going through mourning rituals. It's grieving. And so it would be doing what it usually does, or it would be going back to family members, trying to communicate or trying to say goodbye or whatnot. And that's a whole separate species. Now, there's another species that most researchers encounter, at least demonologists encounter, that it's not limited to just one memory or one motion or one manifestation. It has its own pathology, its own sexual pathology, its own victimology, and its own belief system. It does not fit into the blueprint of any known religion. It eclipses any kind of human IQ, and it is highly, highly predatory. And so that's mainly.
I'll agree with that. I will agree there.
Yeah. So, my research is really centered around that. I mean, I am very much interested in proving consciousness exists after death, but that's not my passion. My passion is to understand these entities on a psychological level, to create a blueprint, a behavioral pattern that's a little bit more predictable than what I was given in my youth, and really to understand why it is we have entities that are manifesting to women and trying to inseminate them, both in UFO abduction phenomenon and in the incubus case studies. So that's my primary study. But what I'm realizing, guys, and I'm not going to ramble, but I want to say this. What I'm realizing is that we have no answers because we're not asking the right questions. And religion, if anything, has limited us to definitions that do not belong in the data sample. And I'm done.
Well, and I totally agree with that, because I think what we're dealing with again, because we've been so conditioned by religion and society, and our Western society especially, on how we look at this type of phenomenon, and we put everything in nice, neat little boxes, when the truth is there's a lot of different phenomenon going on out there. A lot of some of it overlaps, a lot of it overlaps, and something could be happening that you could call it one thing, call it a demon, when it could be something either like an elemental type of nature spirit, or even some type of interdimensional entity, something else, or even as Irene and I have talked about before, like these astral critters, as she calls them, or these parasitic-like creatures that feed off of negative energy, even thought form energies. If they're created by negative energy, they feed off of negative energy. And how do they continue to feed? By creating havoc in someone's life and then feeding off of that energy. But it's nothing more than what you would think of as a paranormal mosquito.
Yes, you're exactly right. And I think that the literature speaks of that. That's why I believe it's important that anybody who gets into this field, it cannot be just a curiosity. It can't just be, like, okay, I just went and downloaded a phone app. Now I'm a demonologist.
Oh, God, and I've run into so many of those.
I've read a book.
Yes, yeah. And what happens is those are the most victimized people among us, because they become targets to these entities, and these entities will go out of their way to embarrass them, to punish them.
You know what? I mentioned Zach Baggins earlier, and I will say that Ghost Adventures is, I've always said this, is my guilty pleasure show. I love Ghost Adventures, and I've always watched it over the years. And for the most part, I don't think they fake anything, and I think most of the evidence that they capture is legitimate. I don't agree with their conclusions, but they also come at it from a very religious standpoint. And the last several years, they focus primarily on quote-unquote demons and negative hauntings, and they have to bring in these exorcists.
Yeah, but that's what gets bums on seats.
Yes, it's selling the fear. It's selling
people in front of the television, doesn't it?
It sells the extreme. And I mean, as actual paranormal investigators, we know that like 9 times out of 10, you walk into a place to investigate it, you come out bored to tears because nothing's happening.
Exactly right. And so they have to create a new, form of conjuring something. But And what really disturbs me, guys, is how the same person can be possessed by the same old lady every case. Like, that just doesn't happen.
Well, you can ask Mark that one. Is I'm sorry, but I don't mean to do it.
Well, I'm possessed by her every week. We do this show.
Yeah, but you're right. Yeah, the same old lady all the time. Yeah.
Well, or like again, I'm sounds like I'm picking on Zach here, but I think Zach is. And even some of the other guys, but Zach especially, has been so prone to all these negative attachments and hauntings and whatnot. And they go into these places.
He's got notice above his head, come and get me, hasn't he?
Well, you know what? They did that very early on. And I think that what he's dealing with is several different types of attachments that he's welcomed in early on, and they follow him case to case. And half the time, I think they're dealing with the same damn entity or energy every single time.
Yeah, and that's if he believes.
So every time they put out a show, they've got all this stuff happening straight away. Yeah.
Yeah,
and they don't sit there for a week and then build it all up and put the non-interesting stuff on the cutting floor.
Well,
they can go into a place and in 40 minutes they've got it buzzing.
All of these shows are
right?
Yeah, all of these shows are like that. It seems like everywhere they go, they're getting something.
Yeah.
And again, are they bringing it in with them? Are some shows have faked it? And my feeling on that. I've had my own experiences with shows faking things.
Same as me.
And
work from the script, Irene.
But you know what? How many times have they gone into a place and nothing's happened, and they've had to can that show and go on to do something else? You never see the ones where nothing happens.
Oh, but on Most Haunted, there's always someone off of camera throwing stones.
Yeah, there is, and it's a good subject. I mean, I think that as a researcher, it's very interesting to me as to why they never have incubi cases.
No, they don't, do they? Because they really can't handle that.
No, they can't. Number one. Number two, It would terrify people, and people will pay a certain amount of money to be traumatized until it gets too real, and then they don't want to see it. So that's what I look for. I mean, if these places are as haunted as they're saying, you're going to have at least one entity that manifests in the image of a former lover and tries to seduce a woman. And it's not happening. And I think it's because none of these people want to experience that, and it's not going to sell. So as a researcher, I'm looking at, not that I'm saying that they don't experience anything and they don't catch anything on camera, but the behavioral patterns of these entities, it's quite plain. Yeah. And somewhere along the line, they've had to run into that. And if they haven't, they've either manipulated the data or it's just not occurring. But it's very limiting to researchers because there's a lot of people in the field that are led into it because of curiosity and not out of calling or not out of some kind of disturbance in their life that says, you know what, I'm hungry. I want to know more about this, and I want to know about it, and I want to help people. Mm-hmm. But that's what really happened. There's a lot of what I call anti-intellectualism in the field as well, where the passion themselves, they're not very organic in nature. And when you have an organic passion, it's going to sit there at the data sample, and it's going to ignore everything else, every other dogma, every other sacred cow, and it's going to look at it for what it is. And if we're going to look at this phenomenon for what it is, we have to realize that we're dealing with a species here that is it's unlike anything we've ever seen. It does not follow the rules like we think it does. Like in the Haunting in Connecticut case, Carmen Snedeker said that there was an entity that was not going into one room in the house because there was a crucifix on the door jamb. Next scene, she says that the entity removed the crucifix from the door jamb. And because of that, it was allowed to move into the room. So again, we need to be asking some very, very important questions. If it does not have the power to move beyond the crucifix, how does it have the power to remove it?
Yeah, very true.
We're dealing with something that's not really in the blueprint.
So incubi, is that what you're researching at the moment?
Yes, that's primarily where it's centered. Yep.
Yeah, and how are you getting on with that?
It's enchanting and it's sinister.
Very sinister.
Yeah, it's the only behavioral pattern that I have been able to link every demon throughout history in terms of every manifestation of the demonic. Number one, your demon, at least in the 16th century, was your incubus. That is the Dybbuk, 100%. The Dybbuk was not the byproduct of someone deciding to get a little bit of wine in them and go to an antique mall and hire, that was not the case at all.
You realize what you're going to do, Nathaniel? There's no end of people out there. They're going to be scared to go to their wine boxes now.
Right.
Hey, I went out and bought a bottle of wine earlier before the show, so.
Well, you know what? You're safe because the definition of a Dybbuk, and I'm just going to put this out there because it's going to lay the groundwork for where we're going. The definition of the Dybbuk is the impregnating of the dead in the bodies of the living. It originated in the 16th century, and that's where my research is couched. It's centered strictly around the manifestation of a male spirit in the life of a female for the purpose of impregnating them. Okay, it's wild.
Now I have to ask this because, and I'm going to bring up a famous incubus case. The one that they made the movie The Entity out of with Barbara Hershey.
Yes.
Which actually, despite the low budget and cheesiness of the final act, was still fairly accurate and scary. And but, and we've had a chance to interview Dr. Barry Taff, who was one of the parapsychologists from UCLA who worked under Thelma Moss that investigated that case. And I don't even agree with his conclusions.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think it's utter nonsense, and I love Barry Taff. I love his work. But him blaming everything on epilepsy is
just ridiculous. But that's his thing, whatever. But you know what? Again, the case of Carla Moran being sexually assaulted by that spirit multiple times. I mean, I got to ask the obvious question: is how in the hell can a spirit, which is non-physical, impregnate a physical person?
Exactly right. First of all, where are they getting these? I don't know if I could say that word, the seed sample. How about that? I'll make it PG. Where are they getting their samples from?
Where are they getting the DNA?
There we go. Where are their biological excretions coming from? So let's go back into history. One of the earliest demonologists to see this phenomenon firsthand, his name was Father Sinistrari of Mino. He's a Franciscan priest. He was showing up to incubi cases within an hour of the event occurring. He had a team of doctors. They were collecting DNA samples from the women. The samples that they were taking were dark in color. They looked like they were secreted from a corpse.
Oh, shit.
And so what we're dealing with, again, is a species of necromancer. I call them the Molters. Yeah. But these entities have been witnessed throughout all of history, especially in London, especially in the UK. They would go to graveyards and milk the carcasses of the deceased, the recently deceased. So that's why throughout history, we would have people, if they had a person that would die, they would try to bury them as soon as possible because they were worried about this phenomenon.
I have to say this
Nathaniel, yes. After we finish this show, I want to tell you something.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I have to
I'm sorry for swearing, people.
We're going to get deep.
We swear no matter what. We try to keep it PG. We're PG-13, okay? We'll swear some, but let me ask you a question. The Molters. This is absolutely the first time I've ever heard of this concept. This is a new one on me. So, being that it's primarily from the UK, Irene, have you heard of this?
No. She might have. She might have heard the behavioral pattern. It's there.
No. Yeah, I can believe it. I can believe it.
Huh.
In fact, I want to look into it a little bit more, actually.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, I know of cases, and I've investigated. I've experienced cases where spirits or other types of entities have dematerialized and materialized objects. Right. Quarters falling from the air right in front of me under the ground. But people who also have experience chemical or some kind of material, like the famous blood or plasma oozing from the walls.
Oh, we used to have that in our house in London.
That's creepy, ain't it? That's probably one of the most. That's the creepiest thing I've ever heard of.
No, it used to come all down this bloody hallway and everywhere.
So the biological excretions that we're dealing with, it goes all the way back into history, and we have to realize that when these entities first manifested, they manifested as what were called dream demons.
Yeah. And
so what happened is we would have a woman who goes to sleep, and she would be induced into a sleep-like state, like she was like what's called an REM state. And in the middle of the dream would seem very much real to her, but she was not. She they wouldn't have the ability to understand if this was reality or not. And so during the dream, an entity would manifest to her. It was either in the image of an ex-lover, or a deceased husband, or a husband that was not home at the house. During that dream state, the entity would groom the woman, and I say that loosely, would manipulate her into intercourse. At the moment of conception, it would inseminate her with seed that it collected as a succubus.
Yeah.
Now, what happened in the 16th century is we had a change in the sexual pathology of these moulters. What used to be an entity manifesting in a dream and just for the purpose of impregnation or all that, it changed into doing that for the purpose of possession.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the 16th century, in a province of Israel called Safdi, we started having women who were possessed by the entity they just had intercourse with. Okay?
Wow. Yeah.
They were called the Dibuk or the Dibuk.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they showed up to the exorcists' homes, they were showing up pregnant and possessed with the entity they just had intercourse with. One famous case is called the Widow of Demona.
Yeah.
She had a dream where her late husband had manifested to her. The next day, she wakes up speaking in the voice of her deceased husband and possessed by him. And she goes and shows up to a guy named Isaac Luria. He's an exorcist. And Isaac Luria is investigating her, and he has his doctors.
Wait a minute. Isn't he the Isaac?
He's Kabbalistic. Yeah, he's Kabbalistic. Yep.
Yeah, he's the he's wait a minute, the lion. Ali.
Mm-hmm.
It's all right. I'm picking stuff up here.
No, you're good. You're good. You're exactly right.
I know I am.
He was huge. So yeah, I love him. He was a beast. I love him. But so that's when they realized that they saw the entity crawled up in her womb in the fetal position.
Yeah.
And so that's when demonology, in terms of the incubi phenomenon, that's when we started realizing that their sexual pathology was mutating. It was evolving according to their plan. And so when we're dealing with the incubi phenomenon, it's not just inseminating a baby in the womb, it's placing their consciousness in it. And if we look at the behavioral pattern here, it's impossible not to see the UFO abduction phenomenon and the missing fetus
impregnation. Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's just in history, we demonized this phenomenon. And in modernity, we're making it extraterrestrial. The behavioral pattern's always been there. It's just we've been trying to define it.
There you go, Mark. That's opened your eyes, hasn't it?
Well, and you could turn that around and say that, it's been extraterrestrial type of activity all along, but because they didn't understand extraterrestrials or even interdimensional types of entities back then, that's what they thought of it as spirits or demons, because so much of it was so strange, with high strangeness and how they appeared and disappeared, that they had no other language, nothing in their language to call it or any form of reference. Exactly, it was beyond their comprehension.
And you know what? That's truthfully, that's where we are right now. I'm good friends with Paul Eno, and one of the things that we always harp on is that even in the 21st century, we're still searching for the correct vocabulary for a lot of what we're experiencing. So that's what really inspired me to take some of the language that I was even taught in my youth as a Christian and try to just separate it from the data and see if we can't flesh out a true behavioral pattern that unites all of this together. And it has. Like if we go into Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, and we look at just what David Jacobs would call the hybrid program with the humans and these ETs, it's all one and the same. It really is. And at the end of the day, because I don't know how much longer we have, but at the end of the day, what we're realizing is that they are using our women to birth children. And I don't really believe that we're birthing hybrids. What I believe is they're impregnating our women, taking the babies, killing the babies, taking the consciousness, and putting it in a hybrid. And I can prove that with the data sample. But
well, that is deep. That is very, very deep.
Well, let me back up.
I've always said there's a connection between the two.
Yeah. Let me back up here because what you're saying kind of flies in the face of what a lot of researchers, UFO researchers, have said, because there's a lot of thought that they're impregnating women with hybrid children, giving birth to these hybrid children, not killing a baby and then transferring the consciousness, because these babies tend to have a mixture of both human and alien features in DNA, so it's a type of hybrid. Yeah. I mean, it goes back to, there's a lot of theories that, the human race itself, we are a hybrid race. We were created hundreds of thousands of years ago, maybe even longer ago than that. Even as Zechariah Stitchin talking about the Anunnaki, from the old Sumerian texts, talking about creating the human race.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is the first that I've heard of, impregnating them, taking the fetus, killing it, and transferring the soul, the spirit, the consciousness?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. The data sample speaks of nothing else. I will say this, that within the missing fetus syndrome, are women that are being taken into hospitals and realizing there's scar tissue left. They've taken the DNA out, and there has not been any other DNA other than babies.
Yeah, I had a friend once that had a missing fetus.
Yep. It's basically just okay, so let's go back into history. Matter of fact, I'm going to pull out a manuscript right now, and I'm going to at least throw out something that will help us understand where the term hybrid first originated and why it should apply. Okay, now, first of all, we need to go back to the Mesopotamian flood myth. We see that in Genesis, but in Genesis, the story of Noah came from Mesopotamia.
Right.
Ah.
Yeah, it was first... It wasn't that bad a Gilgamesh. It was another one, but
yes,
but it was it's a lot of Genesis and a lot of, especially the Noah myth, did come from much earlier writings.
Exactly right. And so what we have to do, we have to go back through history and see what the earliest texts say. Like what I do is I look at what's called comparative etymology. And I try to understand what they meant, why they meant it, and place it in the correct historical perspective. All right. So in Genesis 6, it says that when man began to multiply on the earth, that's when these entities, according to history, manifested. They began to take wives unto themselves, and they began to impregnate them. It's the same behavioral pattern. What we didn't...
Yeah, the Watchers,
correct.
Or the Nephilim, they call them. But then the apocryphal book of Enoch goes into a lot more detail about it.
It does, according to that period in history, right? So what you're going to hear the same sentiments that is preserved in Jewish mythology. But what we don't know is who was to blame. Was it the Watchers? Who were the Watchers? Because in Aramaic, it means they're the wakeful ones. Which I'll go into that here soon, too, because we don't know what the wakeful ones are because it's a reference, right? What are they referring to exactly? Well, there are texts that predated that gives us an idea of what the wakeful ones were. And so that's why I'm doing this research. But look, so let me back up and say this. When men began to multiply on the earth, the sons of God saw the daughters of women and that they were fair, and they took unto them wives. Now, if we're going to look at the narrative here, we have a lot of different manuscripts that disagree with each other. Okay? Like we have this, what's called the Sethite belief, which means that they didn't even believe that these entities were fallen angels or that there were any kind of divine. They just believed that some people hooked up with some women, and for some reason, which they can't explain, they created these giants. And so there's what's called conflict in the texts. They don't know who to blame. They don't know who to judge. And truthfully, none of them really agree with each other on the origins of these entities.
Yeah.
So let's move deeper. It's not until we have what's called the Apocryphon of John. It's like you said, it's another apocryphal writing. It's preserved by Egyptian monks. It wasn't until I got a hold of that I started really putting these pieces together. It's in reference to Genesis 6, and it says that these entities waited until the husbands that belonged to these wives were absent. Some had either died, some had either went out and got maybe a bottle of wine or were at work, or for whatever reason, they were not present in the home when these entities manifested to their wives. Number one. Number two, it says that when they did manifest to these women, they manifested in the images of their husbands. Check. That's an incubi. It's an incubus.
Yeah.
And then it says, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, and then I'll tell you.
Okay. So then it goes further, and it says that during the act of intercourse, at the moment of conception, they performed what's called an obstetric tradition. They stared into the eyes of these women, and then they reversed their apparition to what they really looked like. Now, this is a sexual pathology of the incubus. This is a sexual pathology of the UFO abduction phenomenon. The reason they did that is because they held to a tradition in Mesopotamia that whatever man the woman was focused upon at the moment of conception, she will birth the material image of through her womb as a child. That's when I realized that what we're dealing with are entities that are creating bodies that look like their apparitions.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with ghosts. And I'm going to lay that down now because I'm going to answer questions, but there's so much to talk about because I can prove it any which way.
well, again, a lot of that's...
have you got fascination? Did you have a fascination or anything with Noah?
With regards to Noah? Yeah, Noah's a big player in this. One thing that we have to realize, guys, is when we're dealing with the Watcher narrative, what is a Watcher, right? Can I tell you that Watchers originally were people who guarded the bodies of the dead?
Yeah.
That's what they were. They were mortals. And I know I'm giving a lot of information out, but...
No, I'm just picking a load of stuff up about Noah, that's all. I don't know why I'm picking it up.
Well, two things. First of all, the way that you described how these watchers would come in and take on the guise of the husbands and then show themselves at the end. The exact same thing is said about Zeus in Greek mythology. Yes. Because
Merlin too.
Zeus could never keep it in his pants, and he was always out there with mortal women, and he would always disguise himself as something else in order to have affairs with them.
You're right. And that behavioral pattern right there is how they're self-replicating. And if we go back into history and we look at the definition of hybrid through the lens of the Mesopotamian worldview, we first have habri, Habru, and it meant noisy. It meant noisy. And that comes from the Mesopotamian flood myth. So if we compare that to Genesis 6, what we have here is the definition of noisy was when these babies were being used in Genesis 6, they were dying at a high rate. They were being born and they're dead. Now watch this. That's why when you get into looking at the version, like, okay, let's look at the word Nephilim and let's strip it from all the vowels because they did not have vowels in Paleo-Hebrew. Okay, you following me?
Mm-hmm.
All right, go on then.
We have a term for abortion, stillbirth, and crib death.
Yeah.
Here's why. Because they were doing the same thing they're doing now. They were implanting babies, taking the consciousness out, placing it into a hybrid they have already placed in it. They're still doing it, which we can even go anywhere you want. But right now, that's where we are. So the word Habru meant noisy. From that, it went to the word Habiri, and then it went to hubris, and that's where we get the word hybrid. That's where it originated in Mesopotamia. Now that's why we have people, and I'm not saying that they're not created a mixture, a race in UFO abduction. I'm saying in terms of the Mesopotamian flood myth, we're still right in the middle of what's been going on. And we need to realize it, because the behavioral pattern and data sample in UFO abduction, it's mirroring this to a T. And I'll stop rambling.
That is very, 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 very interesting.
Well,
it's very troubling.
One thing with Genesis, when it describes how the Watchers came down, had sex with these women, and I think when the whole euphemism, saying they took wives, found them fair and took wives,
right.
is just a euphemism that they came down and had sex, raped them, whatever it was. They had carnal knowledge, and produced these offspring. That was what's interesting in the Genesis version, is that it said that it created giants, but then okay, Mark, I rented lips there. Excuse me. Created giants, but then that's followed by men of renown.
Yes, sir.
So, I know a lot of fundamentalists who look at the Bible and think it's literal giants, like what's his name that
Marzulli?
That David killed.
Goliath.
Goliath, yeah, was supposed to be a giant, but at the same time, I always felt like it was the other version of giant, like someone who was like a giant in terms of their stature and status, and
yes,
that's where the men of renown came from, and. Yep. But then they stop right there, and they don't tell you anything about these supposed deeds of these men of renown. You think if they were men of renown, they would have like a lot of deeds, whole books written about all the stuff that they did. But that's the end of it. They cut it off and they move on. And then people took it to mean literal giants. But right. I look at it's the same thing with, the English language versions, King James version of the Bible, especially in Genesis, when after Adam and Eve eat from the tree and they're in hiding, God walks through the garden, discovers what they've done, and starts talking to himself in the third person. Right. Now, the problem is that they always took it as the royal we, but in the original text, he wasn't named God or even Yahweh. It was Elohim, and Elohim had both plural and singular connotations. And the way God is talking, or this person is talking, he's not just talking to himself. He's talking to like the group that he's working with. Like, oh my God, now they're like us. What are we going to do about it? Well, we got to kick them out of here, because we can't have them being like us. But then it's very similar again, going into Greek mythology, which comes later. There's the story of Prometheus, who did exactly like what the serpent in the garden did. He bestowed knowledge to mankind. He went further than giving them knowledge of good and evil. He gave them fire. He taught them about agriculture, taught them about textiles and making clothes and all these things. And it angered the gods, and he was punished severely. I think he has an eagle tear his innards out every other day or something like that for eternity. But it's the same type of situation. There's one entity that decides to give mankind knowledge that they're not really supposed to have to help advance them, and it winds up pissing off the other gods.
You're exactly right. And that knowledge was only received through death. Like if you go into the biblical narrative of Genesis, it says, okay, you shall not surely die. You'll just become a god. Now, if we're going to look at that narrative, we have to go to the UFO abduction phenomenon, because what they're doing is they're pulling souls out of bodies in addition to abducting people, right? Their bodies in general. Now, when we're going to get into the idea of a god and a ghost, we're sitting right back into Genesis 6 in terms of what a Rephaim is. A Rephaim comes from Mesopotamia. We first found that term in ritual bowls as Repiumai, ghosts, right? And so the Jews would call them Rephaim. And later in the text, they were called Elohim. Matter of fact, it was Samuel, when the witch of Endor pulled his ghost out of the ground, she said, I see an Elohim coming out of the earth. And so what we need to realize, guys, is that when someone dies, there is a transition of consciousness. And it's not just what we would call a ghost, but there's almost an elevation to them. They change. And so if we're going to go look at the behavioral pathology of the UFO abduction phenomenon, they're pulling gods out of bodies as ghosts. Now, you follow me. I know it doesn't make sense yet, but just follow me real quick, okay? According to history, they believe that the ghost of a man was made from the flesh of a god.
Yeah.
So the ghost itself is not as incorporeal as we would think it is. Matter of fact, whatever these entities are that are abducting people, they're very interested in that flesh of a god. They're very intrigued in our souls and our consciousness. That's why one of the most famous abduction accounts, Betty and Bob Luca woke up to watch his wife's soul being peeled out of her body. Can I go further?
Yeah, we actually
carry on. Yeah,
we actually spoke with Betty and Bob, Andreas, and Luca about a year or so ago. We interviewed them.
They're phenomenal, and I'm glad that they're willing to share their story, because it highlighted a behavioral pattern that as researchers we cannot ignore. They're pulling souls out of bodies. That's why in Ezekiel 13, in the Old Testament, Yahweh calls them soul hunters. And so, I'm sorry.
Hey.
Okay. So,
I was just thinking, it's very upsetting, really, isn't it, when you think about it?
Yes.
Especially if you've just lost someone or anything like that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why it's important to look at the data sample. When we get into these UFO abduction accounts, these are not prickly, jelly bean eating rabbits. These are entities that are necromancers. Matter of fact, Dr. Carla Turner was working with a lady who was pulled out of her body, and she's staring at her corpse on the table. And then she looks to her right, and there is another one of her, another body laying in the corner. And she was not complying with these entities, and they told her, if you do not obey us, we will kill you.
Yeah.
And we will replace you with somebody else. Now, I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to say this. If they're killing her, whose consciousness are they putting back into that body? Right?
Into her body or the other body?
This is where you get your walk-ins. What you call your walk-ins, people that, have had near-death experiences, or they've died, or they've been in a coma or something like that.
These are the molters, guys.
Yeah.
These are the molters.
We've had the opportunity to interview Whitley Strieber a few times, and I've read most of his books, and going all the way back to the original Communion. And one of the things he started talking about very early on, although his ideas on it have kind of changed over the years, is his discovery and experiences with these visitors, as he calls them, being very much involved with our dead.
Yes, sir.
He has seen people during his experiences that he knew that when he came out of it later found out that they had died previously. And even now he is still having interactions that involve his wife who passed away a few years ago. So they seem to be very interested or very involved with the soul.
Absolutely. That is of the highest importance to them. Their absolute passion is that what I call, right, the material of the god. That's what our ancestors believed these entities were. And so if we get into the modern UFO abduction phenomenon and compare all of these behavioral patterns, all of these sexual pathologies, if we compare that throughout history, it's impossible not to see that our ancestors perceived this phenomenon as interacting with the afterlife and coming in contact with the butterfly form of who we are right now as human larvae. That whatever these entities are, they were deceased people who evolved into the material of what we would call gods. Now, why is that so important? I know sounds real woo, and I know it sounds out there, but this is not Nathaniel. This is basically everything that UFO abduction phenomenon is telling us. Now, let's get back into Dr. Carla Turner's work. It's not just that they're pulling souls out of bodies, but there was one case when she was working with a man by the name of... Yes.
Sorry. I was just going to say, does this tie in with the mythology of the Grim Reaper?
It may very well. It may very well. We're dealing with death. We're dealing with the afterlife. And specifically with these soul hunters, we're dealing with entities that are self-replicating through us. Create a baby that looks like their apparition. And so what would be the purpose of that, right? And in order to understand that, we have to go through the Genesis 6 narrative. The Rephaim, that where we get the term giants, the Rephaim were ghosts. They were ghosts that had died, ghosts that had created new bodies for themselves, and that had stepped into what Fritz Kramer calls a new social skin. This is also why in Genesis 6, they were called the Zamzummim. They were called the Zamzummim because it was actually the Ammonites who called them Zamzummim. The reason they were called Zamzummim is not because that term is a concrete title, but Zamzummim was the only word they had in their vernacular that sounded like the language these entities used to speak to each other in, okay?
Yeah.
So it was a buzzing sound. It was a chirping, a chattering sound. Now, we don't really have context to that until we get into necromantic rituals. We go to the book of Isaiah, and we go to other rituals of Mesopotamia, and we realize that these necromancers, real necromancers, living necromancers, had a language of death that they would communicate in when they were possessed by consciousness. And it was a buzzing sound. It was a chirping and a muttering.
High-pitched buzzing.
Exactly right. So what are we dealing with in Genesis 6? We're dealing with necromancers.
Yeah.
What are we dealing with in UFO abduction phenomenon? Necromancers. Very interesting. And I'll
Well, here's the thing, and I want to make sure I understand what you're saying, because when it comes to the UFO phenomenon, and I'm basing this off of not only years of research, but of all the interviews that we've done over the last 10 years with experiencers themselves. And it seems like that we're dealing with a variety of different races with different agendas. So are you implying that they all fall under this one umbrella, or are you saying that there maybe are certain of these entities, whether they're extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or whatnot, that fall into this category, and it's not the entire phenomenon?
I think it's the entire phenomenon for now, and here's why. Here's why I do believe that, and that's where I'm at my present research. Now, I could learn something, right? Because I'm deaf, obviously, but I can learn something because my research is constantly evolving. But what we have right now, according to the data sample, is we could have one abduction and have every known entity that's manifested during abductions in that one abduction. We can have a mantis being, right? We could have a gray. We could have, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nordic, all in the same abduction, all taking semen samples, or all of them manifesting in the same event. So truthfully, I do not believe we have seen what they really look like. I believe they've been doing this all along to us. They have manifested to us in images that we would believe in. Okay, number one. Number two, it's the same thing they've always been doing. So let's look at the UFO abduction phenomenon in terms of their manifestations. We have cases where people have called on Jesus and they've manifested as a Swedish Presbyterian version of Jesus and not as the Hebrew rabbi version of Jesus. Why? Because that individual probably didn't believe in the rabbi Jesus. Her version of Jesus in her imagination was whatever they manifested as. It's very important, guys. Can I go deeper?
Go for it.
Okay, so in my second book, The Skin That Crawls, I have a chapter called Born of Belief. And I detail this individual that I've been working with, who lives in India. And the woman is about 32, 33 years old. And when she first reached out to me, she said, because there was an incubus spirit that has been plaguing her for years now. So I asked her, I said, okay. And I had to ask certain questions as a demonologist because I'm looking for a behavioral pattern. I'm wanting to see if this entity is going to follow the same sexual pathology as these other entities do. So number one, I said, okay, how many images has this entity manifested to you as? She said it has manifested to me in different times as all 8 of my lovers. Now, how would that entity know what image that lover was, right? How did that, what did that lover look like? Number one. Number two, why would it desire to manifest in something she was already aware of? Because that person already had intercourse with that woman, so that entity knows that she's more prone to have intercourse with somebody she's already had intercourse with. Number one. Number two, it's tempting her. Number one, right, this is very interesting. Do you believe that I am who I appear to be? Yeah. If so, can I fulfill that role to completion? This is why it's important when we're dealing with these manifestations. I'm telling you, these are very predatory. That's why.
So that's a bit like, yeah. Okay, go on.
Yeah. So that's why. Okay, there's another case that I've been working on with a gentleman whose father was a renowned remote viewer, and his father was being paid by different politicians and celebrities to get readings and whatnot. And he said that one night his dad was doing a reading, and he had laid on his bed, was going through his ritual. And next thing he knows, he said, my dad is stumbling down the stairs. He's inconsolable. He's like breathing heavy. He passes out. He ends up having a heart attack. He says, when we get to the hospital, we're putting his robe on him, and we look at his chest, and we notice that something or someone has carved different religious amulets on his chest. I have the pictures of him. Once they got his father sedated, they asked him, Dad, what happened to you? He said, I did my ritual, and I was in a ship, check, right? And I was consulting with my guides. They appeared to me as everything that, they've always been to me. Yeah. And he said, but there was a certain time where I realized that these were not the entities I thought they were at all. And during that moment, in a fleeting moment, in a blink of an eye, they reversed their apparitions. And he said, next thing I know, I'm back into my body, and I'm looking at my chest as they began to carve the Star of David, a cross, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. They carved it onto his body. Now, I'm going to say this. We have evidence that they're carving it first on the soul. And when the soul gets back into the body, it's manifesting on the body second. Now, my point here, guys, is this. They were manifesting to this individual as what he believed them to be. Same thing with the incubus. And it's not just what would you believe in, but what would you prefer me to look like? And it's for the purpose of manipulation. Ted Rice, Dr. Carla Turner, was working with Ted Rice. He was a medium. Okay, he worked with guides too. Same phenomenon. He's abducted with his grandmother. Now let's look at the behavioral pattern here and the sexual pathology. He's abducted with his grandmother. They're in a ship. the entities put out a hybrid man to have intercourse with her. Now watch this. It's very profound.
Yeah.
They're searching for consent. Do you believe in this? Will you consent to the image you're about to have intercourse with? Why? It goes back to what they were doing in Genesis 6. It's all about the image. It's all about staring at the eye. So his grandmother looks at the image and says, I've only been intimate with one man in my entire life. Genesis 6, right? Husbands. It's my husband, and he's been deceased now for 11 years. Time out. Behavioral pattern will never lie. Out of the corner of the room, from the darkness, emerges her husband. Same thing. In that moment, it's tempting her. Do you believe I am who I say I am? And if you do, for some reason, there is what I call a permission of will that exists. It's a freedom. It's a license in which they get to operate in a dimension that exceeds.
So they're able to take possession.
Yes, 100%.
I'll
shut up.
It's almost like the vampire lore where they need, or even black-eyed kids, which is a new phenomenon these days, where they need permission in order to enter the house or to interact with you. They're looking for that. They're asking you, "Hey, can we come in or let us in?" You're like that famous image from when they did the TV show of Salem's Lot. You know, the kids scratching at the window, "Let me in, let me in." Can't come in on their own. They have to be invited.
Exactly. There's a window of permissive will that they exist in, that they look for. I found certain other characteristics of it. But I mean, if we're going to look at what belief is to them, it's almost as if it's a license of covenant. And that's why when I look at these different abduction accounts, there's only one common denominator that I've noticed in their manifestations. There's usually an entity there that is translucent, that has a ghost apparitional-like quality. This is why when you go to Chris Bledsoe's...
Can I just read you a question I wrote down? I wanted to ask you. Wanted to ask you, can they shapeshift to some people? The energy is invisible or not invisible, and they mute. Oh Christ! I've gotten tongue-tied. And we know they can manipulate, communicate through telepathy.
Correct.
Yeah.
Are you talking about what?
That's something I've thought about to ask him. One of the questions I was going to ask him, and he's just answering it now without me having to ask him.
Yes. Let's go to Göbekli Tepe for a quick moment. In Göbekli Tepe, our anthropologists are digging up what are called eye idols. E, right? The eye. It's a common thematic element throughout all of this literature. The eyes. So what these eye idols consisted of was just a humanoid-shaped idol, figurine. No mouth, guys. No mouth. Just large eyes. And the reason our ancestors in Göbekli Tepe created these idols is because they believed these idols were their ancestors. Now, your anthropologists take that, and they say this, and it blew my mind, guys. They said that the reason our ancestors created these eye idols is because they believe that ghosts, I'm getting passionate, that these entities had an ability to communicate without the mouth.
That's right, telepathy, yeah.
Telepathy. So what we're dealing with, guys, again, I'm going to get back to the soul transference here. There's a unified stream of consciousness that exists. So let's go back to Betty Luca. Betty Luca's soul was pulled out of her body. Her body was still in her bed. She remembers the abduction. How? Right? She saw during the abduction how her body's in her bed.
Yeah.
And when her soul got back into her body, Bob said her body began to manifest skin conditions. You follow me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very interesting. It's the same thing that happened with the remote viewer that I know, right? All of a sudden, when his soul got back into his body, he begins to manifest, in this case, it was religious amulets. Let's take those two cases, put it to the side. Let's dig even deeper. In Ian Stevenson's work, Ian Stevenson, for those who don't know, because I didn't know either at one time, Ian Stevenson works with people who claim to have had past lives. And in his research, he encountered a litany, I'm talking thousands of people, who said that I was killed in a certain way. And there's a portion of my body, a part of my body that was affected by the mortal wound. And guess what? It shows up on the body they're in right now.
Yeah, like a birthmark or something like that. Yeah.
So what we're seeing here, guys, and this points to the narrative of the UFO abduction phenomenon. I do not believe that they're solely taking biological sample of an ova. I believe that they're pulling that material of a god out of us, and they're either studying it, they're either using that to self-replicate.
Yeah.
Either way, we're dealing with a species of necromancer that is intimately connected to us, consciousness, and the afterlife.
Now, do me a favor and define the term.
You're good.
Define the term necromancer, because, you know, the term as it is normally understood with people is like wizard, or, you know, like J.R.R. Tolkien used it for mentioning it in the Lord of the Rings Hobbit. But it's like a human type of sorcerer.
Correct. Now, there are two kinds of necromancy. So, like, there's one from a necromancer who is the classical from a necromancer. Like you said, you'd probably see in the Lord of the Rings, where they would have a ghost or something that they would conjure up for guidance or for a reading. There's a second form of necromancy where they would actually take a corpse and they would conjure up consciousness and place the consciousness in the body and revive the body. Now, our oldest demonologists believe that that's how the succubus was harvesting her samples from corpses, right? They would reanimate the body that was recently deceased, take the sample, and change it to an incubus, and then try to implant it in a woman. So that's the two definitions of a necromancer. And we're dealing with the same phenomenon.
Now, with this taking of souls and placing them in, like, say, a hybrid body or whatnot. Yes, so in effect, they're killing the human child, which is what, disposed of?
Either that or, taken as a sample or something. I'm not sure about that, but yeah.
Or fed for dessert, their version of Thanksgiving. But then...
Oh, you're wicked.
Yes, I know. I'm evil. I blame your friend. Anyway,
sorry. But
then it gets to, and this is something else, you know, again, in a lot of the research I've done, if that is possible, to take someone's soul, transferring it into another body, but then what happens with that soul? Is it under their control? Does it have the same consciousness, mind of its own, like body switching?
Consciousness is 100%.
So, like, they could come and take my soul and put it in a hybrid body, and then I wake up, look at myself in the mirror, and I go, "What in the holy hell is this crap?"
Right. Well, I'm going to say this. That's not Nathaniel saying that. If you go back into Dr. Carla Turner's book, Taken, that's what they're telling abductees, straight up. Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, they had an individual named Lisa, which wasn't her real name in the book Taken. But they told Lisa, they said, "Do you remember that time when you got into the ship and you split into two?" What are we looking at here, guys, right? We're looking at consciousness leaving a body. That's what they're talking about. And matter of fact, like they even told Betty Luca and different other abductees that there's going to be a time where they're preparing bodies for people who die, so that when they die, they can possess another social skin, right? Another biological vehicle. Now, and unless we go through history and we understand that that's what they were doing in Genesis 6 with babies, we'll never grasp what they're doing today. That's why in Genesis 6, we have apparitions creating children and then stepping into them. And so in my book, The Skin That Crawls, I talk about how the ghost grows in the body of the baby. And so when that baby grows up, it looks like the apparition that's in it. Okay? Now, that's not transient possession. And that's not even Malachi Martin's version of perfect possession. What we have now here is a ghost living. That's the definition of the deep book, right? The impregnating of the dead in the bodies of the living. So that species of necromancer existed throughout all of history. So if we're going to go down to the narrative and say, okay, what was the purpose of this? We're dealing with a species that cannot exist unless it self-replicates.
And it only self-replicates by stealing the souls of humans to put into their hybrid bodies.
Yes. It's a convergence. It's a self-replicating species.
Okay. So what is to keep? Here I'm playing. Pardon the pun. Devil's advocate here. What is to keep the people who have been transferred from one body to another from rebelling and saying they're not going to go along with this crap?
I don't think they can. That's a part of that's a deep part of the research that I have yet to get into.
Maybe they don't know.
Yeah, you're right. So what we're dealing with now, okay, is this. How do I say that? Lisa. Okay, let's take Lisa. Let's take Lisa for example, and this is Dr. Carla Turner's work. Lisa had a dream, and in the dream, or it's actually an abduction. I'm sorry, she had an abduction. It was in a dreamlike state, and Jesus. Okay, again. Not Jesus, according to an Erie scholar, right? No, because it would have called the bluff, right? This isn't the historical Jesus. This is a Jesus that Lisa would have believed in according to her imagination. That's who she believed or would have believed Jesus was. So that's what they're doing. But this Jesus manifested, and he uttered some of the most troubling, chilling words I've ever read. He held his hand out and put it in her face and said, "All seed is mine."
All things are mine.
All seed.
All seed.
This should disturb every waking human being.
Yeah, well, here's something I'm going to throw out there because, again, in a lot of the people that I've interviewed and reading on their experiences, these different species, these aliens, these entities, whatever the hell you want to call them. Right. First of all, they are very manipulative, and they do use shape-shifting false memories and can appear. And in fact, it's very much like spirits do when people, let's say, like, the miracle at Fatima, where they seem to say they saw the spirit of Virgin Mary. She never called herself Virgin Mary. It was just some kind of woman who showed up, but in their minds, it was the Virgin Mary. Same.
You're exactly right.
Because they're from a Catholic background. But there are even people who have had, let's say, a near-death experience, and they go on the other side, and let's say they meet Jesus. Now, there's a part of me that thinks they're not really meeting Jesus. They're meeting whoever it is that's assigned to meet them is putting on that image of Jesus to better convey whatever message, whatever, thoughts or whatnot to that person to be able to more accept. Exactly. Betty and Barney Hill, their case, when they had their abduction back in 1966, I believe it was, their conscious memories were of seeing the craft on the road. They stopped. They could see in the window, and it looked like humans wearing these uniforms and caps and whatever. That was the screen memory that was placed in their mind. It wasn't until they were under hypnosis that the true form of these gray aliens appeared and showed themselves. But there's a lot of other different types of energy. And Mike Cleland has written a book called The Messengers. I don't know if you've ever read it, which deals which deals a lot with owl imagery and how, for some reason, the imagery of owls shows up in a lot of abduction phenomenon. And I think a lot of it is either a metaphor or it's a type of screen memory that's being used. You know, owls, even Whitley Strieber mentioned it, you know, the owls, it was a way of masking the real image of the aliens with the big eyes. You know, you look at an owl, you think big eyes, and the aliens have big eyes. So they can definitely manipulate and appear as something completely different in your mind's eye and manipulate you that way.
Exactly. Not just that, man, because I completely agree with you, but we also need to look at ancient funerary rites. Okay? Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Because those birds were often there. They were employed in Egyptian hieroglyphs and Phoenician texts. These were birds that would watch the deceased, or they would I guess they would basically suggest or prophesy that there was a death coming. It was impending. These are death birds. They're death birds. And that was the imagery in antiquity. So if we're going to get into that narrative, we have to look at this and say, okay, if we looked at the rituals they're performing and say, okay, where in history have we ever experienced or even had to believe that you can separate the soul from the body like they're doing in abduction, number one, and how and why would they do that? The only time we have in history, the only writings we have that we would even mention that is the origin of the ghost. And it was basically the end of life ritual called the Atrahasis Epic. It's in English, it's called His Wind is Released. That was the way our ancestors took the soul out of the body and assisted it in translating into what's called a transfigured soul, which is what we're dealing with now. And so basically, guys, my research is rooted in the fact that I believe this phenomenon is a form of the afterlife. And if these species aren't all one, if they're not all necromancers, at the very least, there is a malevolent necromantic species out there that is killing our babies and taking the consciousness and placing it into other hybrids. Where do I get that from? I'm just going to give you one example. And I'll shut up because I know I've introduced a lot of thoughts out there tonight. But Lisa, again, she was in an abduction. Jesus showed up. He holds his hands out to her, and he says his palm, and he says, "Look," he says, "all seed is mine." Sounds like an incubus.
Yeah.
All seed is mine. 3 months later, she finds out she's pregnant. Okay. So 3 months later, she finds out she's pregnant. 5 or 6 months later, she starts having issues. She goes to the hospital. The doctor says, "I don't understand it. You were pregnant, but the baby's dead. It's gone. What happened?" What do you mean? Well, it's the baby's not here anymore. Like there's some skin cells here. There's some DNA there. There's some scar tissue left over. It's either you passed it, you've done something. There's something missing here. It's not right. She went home and grieved and consoled to her husband and wept because she's thinking, okay, I just lost this baby, and everything is really, traumatic. Well, guess what? This is where it stands. She's abducted again. And during that abduction, they give her a hybrid baby, not the baby that was in her womb, a hybrid baby. And during her regressions with Dr. Carla Turner, she's basically weeping and says, "Dr. Carla, I don't understand." She said, I got chilled, man. All right. She said, "When I was holding that hybrid, I knew that my baby's consciousness was in that child."
Yeah.
What are we dealing with here? Because the hybrid program is absolutely not what David Jacobs thinks it is. I do believe it's hybridization, but I don't believe it's just DNA, guys. They're playing with our consciousness, and they're self-replicating through our souls and our bodies. And I'll shut up.
Well, here's
that is so deep. This is one of the deepest. I'm going to listen to this tomorrow again. I really will listen to this tomorrow again, and I want to really absorb everything that you've been saying.
Yep.
Well, see, I want to also throw a few other things into the mix here, because there have been reports from many abductees that a lot of these experiences that they seem to have, let's say they on board these ships, they're not really in the physical. As you mentioned, there are times when they seem to have come out of their body and are interacting on these ships. And I think a lot of it is they're having out-of-body experiences because a lot of these entities can't operate in our third dimension. So these experiences are taking place in another level of reality. So in essence, the person is astral traveling to interact with these beings. Now, Dr. John Mack, in all of his work with doing hypnotic regressions on people and his 2 books that he put out before his death, there are many times, and even Dolores Cannon in her hypnotic work talked about how people who are here now and having these experiences actually before this lifetime were either one of these beings and then or they had a contract with these beings to incarnate into a human life and go through this experience for specific purposes.
Correct.
So is it stealing souls, or is it working with souls that have already, again, if you go beyond just this single lifetime, if you look at it, I'll use the word reincarnation, but not just that, if the immortality of the soul, having different experiences, not only in this planet and in this dimension, but multiple dimensions, multiple times. Is it theft? Is it something done for an evil purpose, or is it something part of a bigger plan?
Survival of a species.
So, yes, the survival of their species. Again, we're dealing with dead people. We're dealing with people who lived and died and are trying to self-replicate. Now, with regard to John Mack's research and Dolores Cannon, I will say this. Again, whatever we're dealing with, it has to be a form of reincarnation. It has to be. But even more than that, there is a sinister species to this. And that's more so what I'm focused on. You know, like I'm not saying that the other part of that isn't possible. It could be very possible. But what we're looking at right now is a species that has been manipulating religion and hiding behind religious figures to manipulate us, to get us into a form of consent and permissive will that they've existed in for millennia.
Well, that I don't disagree with.
All right, go on.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Irene.
I just wanted to tell you about someone that contacted me once, a very close friend, very experienced in astral travel, studied astral travel and one thing or another. And he contacted me one day and he said, he's from the Orient. And he contacted me one day and he said, Irene, I had a terrible experience last night. He said, I was preparing myself, my body, so that I could astral travel. And suddenly he said, I had this thing on top of me and it was pulling the energy. It felt like it was pulling the energy out of my body. I had to fight. I had to fight this thing. He said, I can't. He said, it's very difficult to explain, but he said it was a heavy weight, similar to a night terror, I suppose. But he said it was like a heavy weight, and he said I could literally feel something being pulled through my body.
Yes, 100%.
And he
we
had
don't
to
know what
fight it
that
off.
is yet. We don't know what that is being pulled yet, right? We know it's consciousness because we have people seeing without eyes and remembering without a brain, correct? And the nature of this phenomenon is very troubling because they're eclipsing every known religion. We do not know what kind of morality, if they have morality at all. What is it? And I'll stop. But, there's a lot of things to talk about.
Well, I mean...
he was very frightened, very frightened.
Yeah, as far as morality goes, we can't expect another race to be. We try to put human traits on everything,
right?
And we can't expect. In fact, that's what a lot of experiencers have talked about. How these beings that they interact with, they don't think, their brains don't work the same way ours work. They don't reason. They don't have quite the emotions that we have. Part of the reason why they feel a lot of us are being studied.
Yep.
I agree that there are some races. I'm going to flat out say I don't believe it's all of them. I do believe that there's a variety of different races interacting with us right now. Some do not have our best interests at heart, and I think some are either neutral, or some may even be benign and trying to help us. Depends on who you talk to at any given day. But what you're describing could fall into what a lot of people are talking about in terms of what's going on currently in the world, and the mass manipulation of society, and pushing us in a certain direction, and adding more and more control over people, and more people giving up control.
Okay. Yeah. As an allegorical reference, absolutely. What's most interesting to me about this, guys, is, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm glad you guys let me ramble, man, because a lot of people don't.
We'll have to have you back. We will have to have you back on this show.
This dream state that these entities induce into abductees, that's why our ancestors called them dream demons. And if we get back into David Jacobs' work, he believes that the reason they stare into our eyes is because they're accessing our optic nerve. I believe that's true, but I want to take it a step deeper that will help us explain why they're inducing these sleep states and how they're doing it. Right behind their eyes, we have what's called the medial frontal orbital cortex. It's the part of our brain that decides whether or not what we're experiencing is real.
Yeah.
Is it a movie? Is this a dream? And so even throughout history, demons, or what we would call demons, were invading our dreams. And especially in an REM state where our brain is basically shut down, and where our mythology says our souls would leave our bodies. We would call that an OBE. Mm-hmm. That's how they're operating. They will separate the soul from the body and capture it. Now, in Ezekiel 13, we have the narrative where Yahweh calls them soul hunters. And he gives us an explanation of their victimology. He says that these entities will go into homes at nighttime. Like I said, they will induce a sleep state in their victims, capture the soul, and then cut a piece of their flesh off. That's why Yahweh called them soul hunters.
Cut a piece of their flesh off.
Right. Skin conditions is really what they're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Skin conditions, or abductees who talk about like scoop marks,
scraping, scrapings.
It's the same stuff, and I guess I'll end with this because I know I've been talking forever and I don't want to bore you guys. But even if we go into the Bible, their definition of leprosy is not the modern definition of leprosy. Like today, we have what's called Hansen's disease, but according to your rabbinic sources, that's not what leprosy was to them. Number one, they believed, again, look at the behavioral pattern. They believed leprosy was a spiritual condition first, right? And then it manifested on the skin second. It's the same phenomenon here. I mean, it's very interesting stuff. But there's all kinds of different narratives that weave themselves together, and they really make me think that, number one, religion has gotten demonology wrong, and I think that to a large degree, the UFO abduction phenomenon is disincarnate consciousness. It has to be, at least some portion.
Some portions.
Well, I always knew it was connected. But, you've really given me something to think about, and I expect you've given our listeners something to think about as well.
Yep. Even if it's just another perspective. I'm not saying I'm completely right or anything. I'm a researcher, right? I'm supposed to evolve and grow into these things.
Yeah.
So at least it's something to think about.
Wow.
Yeah, it's something I'll definitely be thinking about, especially if I talk with
when you go to bed tonight.
experiences moving forward. No, I ain't worried about it. I've never had an experience, so it doesn't bother me. They ignore me. But yeah, although I did experience a couple bouts of sleep paralysis when this one house I lived in, but I never felt anything like what you were describing or saw anything. Most of my stuff has been a little bit more on the traditional paranormal than anything else. But I do know of people who have dealt with a lot of these beings, and again, like I said, sometime on a different vibrational level, not in our physical reality. And even the way the technology these beings can sometimes use, floating people through walls, even though it feels like they still are solid. Is it really that they're solid, or is it that they're going traveling astrally? Mm-hmm. But it seems to me like there's something.
There's so much more to this, We're going to have another conversation.
Yeah, there is something more going on, because I don't think it's, and again, I'm only going off of what we're talking about here tonight. But I don't think it's as cut and dried as this. I think it's the phenomenon itself is a lot more complicated, and there's a lot more moving parts involved. And that is by no means dismissing what you're saying tonight, because I found it very, very intriguing, and it's something I want to look deeper into. I just only going off of other people who have had firsthand experiences and their stories, listening to what they have to say, I have to kind of look at it in a new light, because I always try to keep an open mind to new concepts. Right. I'm constantly learning. What I knew 5 years ago is completely changed to what I am today, and where am I going to be in 5 years from now?
Correct. And that's the question: are they a threat or not? And I'm not saying that my research is all encompassing. Again, I grew up in this field as a demonologist, so I'm looking for the malevolent. Correct. Mm-hmm. I'm like that's why the earliest demonologists were physicians, because they weren't there to give people doses of sugar. Right. They were there to treat a disease. They were looking for that portion of the phenomenon that was a plague instead of a pleasure. And so that's more or less why I'm doing this. But there's a lot more of my research that goes even deeper into some of these topics. And hopefully, maybe one day I'll come back and we can do another show on that aspect of it too.
Oh, absolutely.
Before you go, though, I want to talk to you about the eyes.
Okay.
Do people see them?
Do people see the eyes?
When they look at you? Because, okay, right. A few weeks ago, I was laying in bed, and it was dark, and all of a sudden, I had my eyes shut, and when I opened them up, all I could see was the eyes, two eyes looking at me. Mm-hmm. And you know how the iris is, if you've got like blue eyes, you've got a black ring going around the edge? Mm-hmm. These were white. A pure white ring going around the edge of these two eyes. And as soon as I turned around and said, "What do you want?" it just disappeared.
Wow.
Usually you say something a little bit stronger than what you want.
Well, no. For some reason, I didn't say the F word. Not with this one. I just asked it what it wanted. I thought it was a remote viewer. Well, I was picking up on a remote viewer. So, but it did make me think. Now you're beginning to make me think. If I'd maybe just looked at it a bit deeper or carried on for a little while, not said anything, what would have happened? Correct.
I'm going to say one real quick. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's...
Why don't we go ahead? We are actually running at the end of the show here, so if you had a final thought, why don't you go ahead and get it out now?
Just real quick. Because we're dealing with the eyes. There's a phenomenon in the UFO abduction field that I call it switching eyes. I'm going to read an account for you. It's just like a paragraph. So this is an abductee that was abducted at 10 years old. Mm-hmm. They said that I was immediately aware. This is before the abduction took place. This individual's in bed. I was immediately aware that for some reason I was seeing through someone else's eyes as they approached the house from the west. I did not know who they were or how it was possible to see through its eyes. I felt it was somehow able to read my thoughts and it was allowed to be looking through my eyes.
Yeah.
I have come to understand it as a two-way channel that once open cannot work one way. Now, we're dealing with a unifying stream of consciousness. I think that is the exact phenomenon they were talking about in Genesis 6 in the Apocrypha of John, which we covered. And I do believe that what they've been doing is they've been manipulating history, looking into us to see what we're willing to believe in, and then conforming our screen memories around that. And that's it.
That's quite possible. Well, Nathaniel, you've given us a lot to think about tonight. So our guest tonight has been Nathaniel Gillis. And Nathaniel, tell people real quickly the titles of your books and where they can find them, and how can people get in touch with you?
Okay, so my first book is A Moment Called Man. You can find that on Amazon. And then my second book is out for formatting right now, and it's called The Skin That Crawls. That's where I dive into the subject we discussed tonight. And you guys can find me on social media. I'm on Facebook as Nathaniel J. Gillis. I'm on Instagram as the Nathaniel J. Gillis. And my website is njgillis.com. So that's all my info.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Well,
lovely.
Thank you very much for coming on the show tonight. This has been probably one of the most interesting conversations we've had in quite a long time.
Oh, thank you. I'm humbled. Thank you for having me and allowing me to talk about my passion.
No problem.
It was absolutely fantastic. We will have to come on again. We're going to rebook you.
We'll definitely have you back. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. We have run out of time, so thank you everyone for tuning into another edition of the Paranormal UK Radio Show, the flagship show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. And Irene, where can people hear us?
You know, that really makes me angry. You never mess it up.
You know what?
Never mess it up, do you?
Because I've only said it about 10,000 times.
Everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Wherever you can find podcasts, there we are. Plus, you can always tune in to our streaming station through our website at paukradio.com. And we're also streaming on TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and
Google Podcasts.
Those are the podcast stations. Google, Amazon, Samsung, everybody, every podcast. So everywhere, people. All right. Well, have a great evening, Irene. You have a good evening, and everybody, we will catch you all next week. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.